As the president works to secure border wall funding, he's also disputing reports about his possible ties to Russia. The New York Times reported Friday that the FBI began investigating President Trump after he fired the agency's director, James Comey, in May of 2017. The report says agents were concerned he may have been compromised by Russia.
And on Saturday, the Washington Post reported that President Trump has worked to keep details of his meetings with Vladimir Putin from members of his own cabinet. So Michael Desch joins us now from South Bend, Indiana. Michael, you are the director of the Notre Dame International Security Center. Thank you so much, because these two headlines, I think, really had a lot of head scratching over the weekend and got the president really upset, too, making a lot of denials. So let's start with Friday's New York Times report. Remind us of the circumstances surrounding James Comey's firing and why it prompted the FBI to investigate whether President Trump was perhaps working for Russia.
Well, to put it in context, there were questions about possible collusion between the Trump campaign and elements of the Russian security services going back to the election itself. And so apparently, when President Trump finally fired FBI Director James Comey and explicitly linked it to the Russia investigation, apparently the counterintelligence investigation, which I think had probably been going on prior to that, was started up by the Bureau.
So, again, what I think is really key to point out here, Michael, is what came out in the New York Times, but also what ultimately came out in the Washington Post. And I thought it was sort of telling that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was also asked directly about some of these investigations, because you would guess that in his role as the director of the CIA, he would be made aware of any kind of counterintelligence operations that have to do with Russia. Not necessarily perhaps what may be happening here in the United States, because that would be the FBI, obviously, but you would think that somebody would have briefed him about this counterintelligence operation with regards to Vladimir Putin. And when he was asked directly about that, he sort of evaded the question. And as all the members of the Trump administration have done, they express outrage, and it's the fake news and failing Washington Post and the Amazon, the failing New York Times and the Amazon Washington Post. But not even the president of the United States directly disputed when he was asked by a friendly network whether or not he had ever worked for Russia. What's your take?
Well, I mean, there are a number of possible explanations for the president's reticence on this score. I mean, one is that the Russians have the goods on him, that the Steele report or his economic interests have provided the Russians with leverage over him, and that's what's going on. That's an attractive story if you don't like President Trump, and it's also simple and straightforward. I guess I would caution, though, at this point to say there are also alternative explanations out there. And one possibility, and I guess I sort of incline in this direction myself, is that it may not actually be the case that there's any meaningful collusion between the Trump campaign and now President Trump and the Russians, but for reasons that are different, although hardly defensible. The president is offended by all this, doesn't like the insinuation that he won the presidency illegitimately, and also doesn't listen to his lawyers, who would undoubtedly counsel him not to tweet or say a lot of the things that he does say that come pretty close to looking like obstruction of justice. So we're in the wilderness of mirrors here, and there's a lot of very confused and, some certainly suspicious things that have been done and said. But I guess I would be very cautious at this point about jumping to one conclusion about what they mean.
Let me ask you, Michael, about one of the specific allegations in the Washington Post article, which is that the president confiscated his translator's notes, right, who was in the room with him when he was speaking with Vladimir Putin. How uncommon is that? Can you think of any sort of reasons why a president would take those notes?
Sure. There are plenty of cases historically where presidents have run, very close hold initiatives and cut out parts of the government bureaucracy in their effort to advance their agenda. So the Nixon administration, I think, is a good illustration of this. President Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, had deep distrust for the professionals in the intelligence community and in the State Department, and they routinely, started efforts, including the opening to China, that caught a lot of the rest of the people in government by surprise. So again, there is a malign interpretation for what's going on, but there's also, I guess, a different interpretation for the Washington Post story. So I would caution us against making too much about it. It's not unprecedented.
No, and Michael, I think your point about Nixon and China is an interesting one. But, as Jonathan Chait in New York Magazine reported, I want to share this with our audience. From 2003 to 2017, people from the former USSR, Russia, made 86 all-cash purchases of Trump properties, including $109 million in 2010. The private wealth division of Deutsche Bank also loaned President Trump, then Donald Trump, hundreds of millions of dollars during the same time that it was laundering money for the Russians. And even Donald Trump Jr. said at one point, quote, "Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of our assets. We don't rely on American banks. We have all the funding we need out of Russia." And, of course, the reporting that even as late as 2016, President Trump was still pursuing a Trump Tower in Moscow. So it may not mean anything other than that he's a very astute businessman who wants to do deals with the folks that want to do deals with him. On the other hand, certainly it raises, I think the question that the Washington Post and the New York Times are raising is this a red flag or is it not? And is it something that we as a country need to take a look at in our intelligence agencies and the FBI, or is it just a coincidence?
Yeah, well, and, the fact that it's indisputable that the Russians meddled in the 2016 election, and there was certainly enough evidence to warrant, sitting a special counsel to investigate what's going on. And President Trump has a unique profile, shall we say, for an American president that certainly compounds concerns on these issues. So there's nothing wrong with us looking into it, and nothing wrong, I think, in principle, with concerns about whether, Russian meddling is playing a bigger role than we think. The only thing I would caution, though, is to say there are a lot of people that are pushing the conclusions of this, it seems to me, much further than where the evidence would go. And they're not looking at the alternative explanations, including, the president just is a bull in a china shop and isn't cautious about how he reacts to things when he's upset about them, or that the president came in committed on other grounds to better relations with Russia, and as a result of that decided and knew that he was going to be pushing against the foreign policy bureaucracy and felt the need to run it close hold.
Or this is one of the leakiest administrations that we've seen in a long time, and one could not blame a president for wanting to hold information close, considering it always seems to get out. Hence the articles we're talking about. Michael Desch, thank you very much.
My pleasure.